Hey everybody, and welcome to Storms on the Way. I'm Alistair Stevens, and I'm glad to be here with you this evening to discuss Chapter 10 of Neil Gaiman's classic work, American Gods, a work which is opening up to me the more I study it. The more I look closely at this text, the more I find within it, which is, of course, one of the reasons why our pace is slowing here on the novel side of Storms on the Way. I was supposed to cover chapters 10 and 11 tonight, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to look at chapter 10, which is a fascinating chapter for all that it doesn't contain much in the way of plot necessary event. There's a lot of character work here. There's a lot of world building work here. And there is just an overabundance of Gaiman's crisp, perfect, beautifully composed prose. There's a lot to discuss as we move through this chapter, and I'm very much looking forward to discussing it with all of you. I've got Angela here and Aaron here. Di, I believe, who is in the UK, is joining us at 2 a.m., which is a loyalty that is absolutely beyond any kind of respect. Kim is here, and Becca is asking in the YouTube chat right before we begin, does this feel like the first day back from summer break to anybody else? Yes, Becca, to me, it feels like the first day back after summer break. I didn't do any live sessions last week. This is my first live session. I did record a podcast earlier today, discussing, in fact, the 7th episode of the Starz adaptation of American Gods. So today has kind of been an American Gods day. And this, I think, chapter embodies American Gods in a very subtle way. It is not the most Gaiman-y chapter that we're going to get in this book. It is not the most American Gods chapter that we're going to get in this book. But it is, in some very subtle ways, the most representative of some of the work that Gaiman has done throughout this entire novel, some of the mythopoeia in which he has been engaged, the construction and the weaving together of an aggregate mythology for America, for the United States specifically. Lakeside in particular, and certainly Lakeside as, well, I was going to say contrasted with, but I'm not sure that's entirely true. Lakeside as reflected in Los Angeles, in Las Vegas, really does speak to the heart of Gaiman's perspective on America and Americana. There's a lot here that speaks very directly to his sense of this nation, his sense of this sprawling, raucous geography, his sense of these complex peoples. I can't wait to dive into it. Mitch is already calling out here in the YouTube chat. I cannot wait to hear your thoughts on episode 7. I really like episode 7, you guys. I really like episode 7, particularly as a piece of adaptation. So if you're looking forward to 2 hours of discussion on an hour's worth of television, stick around tomorrow afternoon when I release that episode, which I recorded with the wonderful Daphne Olive and the equally wonderful Elizabeth Stevens. It's a really, really great conversation. Yeah. Good. So let's get into it because we have just so much to cover. Of course, you can interact with me live here in the YouTube chat. You can interact with me live on Twitter using the hashtag StormsOTW, or if you are a Patreon supporter of Point North, you can come hang out in our custom, nay, luxurious, nay, opulent Discord server, and you can chat there too. I have all of these various screens open right here on my desktop, so I can keep up, hopefully, with all the streams of comments and questions as they come in live. If you want to get back to me in the week ahead, if you're listening to this after the fact, you can, of course, email pointnorthmedia@gmail.com. I will see all of those. Angela's saying how much she loves Get Gone. She fell for Laura for the first time. Laura is a magnificent character, and if you haven't yet seen episode 7, A Prayer for Mad Sweeney, then you definitely should. It is a preposterously ambitious and really lovely piece of work. Just beautifully, beautifully done. And the first script by a new writer, which is always exciting. It's always so thrilling to see a new writer step up with a complete mastery of her craft. She's just wonderful, and I'm looking forward to all the work that she will do in the future. So first, before we get into the detail of the chapter, I guess a bit of a quick gloss. Shadow has just arrived in Lakeside. We saw that happen in the last live session, in the last chapter of the book. He begins the chapter by waking from a dream of darkness and imprisonment and imminent sacrifice to discover that winter has claimed Lakeside but hard, and his new apartment is freezing cold. So he undertakes the theoretically 10-minute journey into town and damn near dies while trying to do it. He is picked up by Chad Mulligan, the local chief of police, who takes him into town, shows him around, takes him to Mabel's, the diner, which is, of course, the heart of every good small community is a diner. You need a diner, you need a bookstore. These are the two necessary things, as we learned last time. We have some conversation with Mulligan. He then meets Missy Gunther, from whom he buys a garish purple Jeep. She mentions Marguerite Olsen, who will become significant later in the chapter and still more significant later in the book. Hinzelman drops by with a little... well, with some stories for Shadow. We'll talk a little about those. And then, of course, Wednesday breezes back into town and snatches Shadow away, back into the world of gods and magic, back to Las Vegas. That is going to be a fascinating point of discussion too, believe you me. So let's get to it. As Becca's calling out, the pasties, you guys, they made me so hungry. Yes. And Jonathan observes it's Wisconsin, so technically it needs a bar too. Yes, fair. Fair. We will learn, in fact, that Lakeside has a bar, has a very nice bar. We'll get to that in a few chapters' time. So let's begin by looking at Shadow's dream. This is a really interesting way to start the chapter. We rarely start Shadow's dream. We really start chapters with Shadow's dreams, and we rarely offset Shadow's dreams in italics. This is not in italics on the slide because I wanted it to be a little more legible, a little more readable, but it is still immediately engaging. We are thrust into this dream with a kind of narrative violence, which bespeaks the content of the dream, I think, really rather beautifully. A whole life in darkness, surrounded by filth. That was what Shadow dreamed his first night in Lakeside. A child's life, long ago and far away, in a land across the ocean, in the lands where the sun rose. But this life contained no sunrises, only dimness by day and blindness by night. Nobody spoke to him. He heard human voices from outside, but he could understand human speech no better than he understood the howling of the owls or the yelp of dogs. He remembered, or thought he remembered, one night half a lifetime ago, when one of the big people had entered, quietly, and had not cuffed him or fed him, but had picked him up to her breast and embraced him. She smelled good. She had made crooning noises. Hot drops of water had fallen from her face to his. He had been scared and had wailed loudly in his fear. She put him down on the straw hurriedly and left the hut, fastening the door behind her. He remembered that moment and he treasured it, just as he remembered the sweetness of a cabbage heart, the tart taste of plums, the crunch of apples, the greasy delight of roasted fish. And now he saw the faces in the firelight, all of them looking at him as he was led out from the hut for the first time, which was the only time. So that was what people looked like. Raised in darkness, he had never seen faces. Everything was so new, so strange. The bonfire light hurt his eyes. They pulled on the rope around his neck to lead him to the space between the two bonfires where the man waited for him. And when the first blade was raised in the firelight, what a cheer went up from the crowd, and the child from the darkness began to laugh and laugh with them in delight and in freedom. And then the blade came down. This is just a quietly disturbing, quietly terrifying story. Shadow's account of this dream speaks to an alienation and a dehumanizing lack of contact. Here, Shadow is held apart from community, from life. He is held apart from truth, in a sense. And when he is drawn out into truth, the beauty of the world is such that he himself is moved with no context, with no frame. Here he exhibits a natural state of delight and joyousness, but it is a natural state that is taken from him as the first blade falls. And there are a few phrases more haunting than the first blade, because whatever comes next is going to be ugly, is going to be bloody, is going to be terrifying. Yes. Mitch says, this is an interesting observation. Something about the story reminds me of Japanese mythology, and I can't place what it is. That is a fascinating thought. I'm not immediately reminded of anything, but perhaps there is something within it which speaks to Japanese myth too. That would be genuinely fascinating, particularly because, you know, we're making a connection with the land where the sun rose. That's interesting. Interesting. Yes. Good. So we see here this separation of contextual experience and immediacy. And though I don't think this is necessarily Gaiman's intent here in this opening dream, which I think serves as a gesture toward a veiled beginning of our exploration of Shadow's backstory, Shadow's history, of which we have had by this point very, very little. It's Shadow's backstory, Shadow's personal history is almost conspicuous in its absence by this point in the book. We really don't know anything about him beyond, you know, vague references prior to his arrival in prison, and even then, we're not entirely sure of the details of that either. This is detail presented without context. And what we're going to see throughout the rest of the chapter is a great deal of context presented without unnecessary detail. Throughout our time at Lakeside, we're going to be nestled, we are going to be cradled, we are going to be cuddled and snuggled into an account of this idyllic small town. And I trust that this is a small town which we all find appropriately idyllic. I'm thinking about that sharp contrast as we move forward. The immediacy of this detail, the terror and the darkness and the confusion and the uncertainty, and then the fierce joy that follows, comes from a lack of inoculation. It comes from a lack of contextual experience. Everything is raw and immediate to child shadow, to dream shadow, in a way that it isn't as we move through Lakeside, and isn't even as we move through Las Vegas. Here we have an immediate understanding. Lakeside is, in most senses, fulfilling its role. It is playing the part that it occupies. And that is, of course, going to be all the more fascinating when we can oppose it functionally, meaningfully, in terms of the prose, with Vegas itself. Yes. Aaron says here in the YouTube chat, I remember vaguely a Japanese ghost story about children living in caves and never seeing the light, but I do know that human sacrifice would have been very much antithetical to Shinto beliefs. Sure. Good observation. Dai says there's a theory that historically the ancient Hebrews would sacrifice the firstborn so their soul would protect the family. Interesting. Yes. Yes, we have no more detail than that. Oh, Mitch is calling out the rising sun or the fish or the plums are just the darkness of the story itself, or that I'm a Japanese major and full of bias. Aren't we all, Mitch? Aren't we all full of our own innate bias? But I did want to call out that detail of food because, of course, food is so significant throughout American Gods. He remembered that moment and he treasured it just as he remembered the sweetness of a cabbage heart, the tart taste of plums, the crunch of apples, the greasy delight of roasted fish. Here, we're not given this anonymous, prepackaged, mass-marketed food that we've encountered so often through the pages of American Gods, so much so that it has become, you know, something of a trope, a symbol right at the heart of this book. Again, here we have immediacy, unfiltered by contextual experience, and that is, as I've said, absolutely vital. So from there, Shadow wakes and emerges and discovers that his apartment is, as I said, freezing cold, and decides that he is going to brave the 10-minute walk into town, and immediately regrets it. I don't know how many of you have lived in extremely cold climes. I have, growing up where I grew up in the northeast of Scotland, it wasn't so terribly cold, I have to say. The biting wind in the dead of winter could be cruel, could be, yes, and in some senses dangerous too. But real cold takes a little more direct experience, takes a little more, I don't know, meteorological antagonism to experience the kind of cold that Shadow experiences here in this walk. So let's take a look at the slide here. He was almost at the bridge now. Then he had to walk across it, and he would still be another 10 minutes from the stores on the west of the lake, maybe a little more. A dark car passed him, stopped, then reversed in a foggy cloud of exhaust smoke and came to a halt beside him. A window slid down, and the haze and steam from the window mixed with the exhaust to form a dragon's breath that surrounded the car. "Everything okay here?" said a cop inside. Shadow's first automatic instinct was to say, "Yep, everything's just fine and gin-dandy. Thank you, officer. Nothing's happening here. Move on. Nothing to see." But it was too late for that. And he started to say, "I think I'm freezing. I was walking into Lakeside to buy food and clothes, but I underestimated the length of the walk." He was that far through the sentence in his head when he realized that all that had come out was freezing and a chattering noise. And he said, so sorry, cold, sorry. This is our introduction to Chad Mulligan, Lakeside's chief of police. And this is also our introduction to Shadow's experience with Lakeside, Shadow's experience with this town. And what I mentioned earlier about contextual experience is immediately apparent here. We've already had this description of cars passing like silver spaceships, these impossible creations that are passing him by on the road, and so befuddled are his senses by the immense and ancient cold that he can't even really apprehend them by this point. But he sure apprehends a police car. He knows what this is. He knows the danger that it represents to him personally. He knows that this is not an experience, judging by his past, that he should embrace. And yet, he does so. Yet, he is, in this moment, stripped of his desire to protect himself and embraces a kind of honesty. And he does so crucially, both consciously and subconsciously. He is framing the thought. He is framing the explanation. He is looking for help, but also his subconscious mind, his physical reality takes over too. He can't articulate the thought, but he can articulate the truth underlying the thought. Yep, everything's just fine and gin dandy here. Thank you, officer. Well, no, this is not the time for protection, even though this is very true to his experience. Yeah. Mitch says in the YouTube chat, that level of cold and snow is such a normal part of my experience. I had to take a second to put myself in the shoes of someone from further south. We are all, I think, schooled and trained by our experience to normalize. We all assume that wherever we are and whatever our experience is somehow the median of human experience, that even when it is freezing cold, or if you're living in the desert, even when it is just unbearably, unapproachably hot, or even here in Oklahoma City, as you can tell from my tan, it's been a little warm this last few weeks. We tend to normalize that experience, and that is something that Shadow is immediately beginning to do. Lakeside is not his home, and Lakeside is unlike any home that he has ever had. But Lakeside is also so archetypal. Lakeside is also so fundamentally true and American that it begins to become his home almost immediately. And this is what I was talking about when I discussed Lakeside kind of inhabiting its own role. It is what it seems to be. It is performatively, perhaps if we're feeling suspicious, it is performatively, but it is also kind of comprehensively what it seems to be. It is exactly what we would expect a small town to be. And Shadow's immediate immersion into that, now accompanied by Chad Mulligan, is really worthwhile, I think, to study and to note very carefully, particularly because we remember his time in Eagle Point. And Eagle Point, firstly, did not receive this lavish kind of attention. And we have no reason to believe at this point that Eagle Point wasn't similarly an idyllic small Midwestern town, that it wasn't Lakeside South. But Shadow wasn't connected to it. Now here, Shadow still isn't connected to it. Not really, not functionally, but he is present. And that very presence seems to be enough. Lakeside seems to be working its magic upon him, seems to be drawing him in, and that is vital. And of course, we have to remember too that Shadow is not entirely, at this point, himself. He is masquerading under an assumed name. He is right now not Shadow Moon, but rather Mike Ainsel. And that twist of identity, well, we'll get to that later as we highlight it perfectly. Yes. Good. Jonathan Nash says, Wisconsin is built predominantly on Scandinavian and Polish cultures. Exactly. So this is one of the things that I think I didn't really understand about this book until I came to the United States. This is something that I didn't necessarily understand about this book until I had spent some time traveling the Midwest. I've never been to Wisconsin specifically, but I've seen communities form around these kinds of cultural associations. The settlement pattern in the diaspora across this continent does give these interesting pockets of existent culture. I think that the deep cultural rooting of these communities in Wisconsin in Polish and Nordic cultures primarily I think that rooting is absolutely vital to understanding those communities, because it's not the same. This is not Polish culture. This is not Scandinavian culture to the degree that there is any such thing as Scandinavian culture, you know, in the broadest possible sense. That sounded horribly dismissive. That sounded like I was saying that, hey, you know, the Scandinavians, they just don't have any culture. That was not what I meant. What I meant was that Scandinavia is simply too big to have a single unified culture. But this is not those cultures. This is not even necessarily an amalgam of those cultures. What it is instead is something wholly new. It has those roots, but the tree that rises from those roots is informed by other things too. It is still quintessentially American. So I do want to pay very close attention, and if you're reading along with me as we're going through the chapter, do pay very close attention to Shadow's integration into Lakeside, the way in which he is himself normalized, and the way in which he is almost intuitively, almost osmotically normalizing Lakeside itself. We'll keep pushing onward, ever onward. Nevada is weird, says Becca Eller. We go from -30 to 120 every year. That sounds terrifying. That sounds like too many degrees. Becca, that sounds like too much of a swing. That's a terrifying thing. I will have to come to Nevada and check it out. Though I myself, I have to say, I'm generally inclined toward extremes of temperature. I very much like, and perhaps this is because I did grow up in the rather temperate northeast of Scotland, where there isn't a great deal of difference between, you know, spring, summer, and autumn are all roughly the same, very, very wet, and maybe 60 degrees, you know, on a good day. And then the winter gets a little colder and we get a little snow, but it isn't too harsh. I'm actually rather drawn to places that have bipolar meteorological microclimates. That's always something that speaks to me. Yes. Good. Yes. Jonathan says, as Lewis Black loves to say, the immigrants started heading west and ended up heading north and stopped when they got to where they found familiar weather. Yes, indeed. Indeed. Good. All right. So let's move on, because we have to get to, we talked last time talking about what it is that defines a small town. And we've talked a little here in the YouTube chat tonight about, is it a bookstore? Is it a number of churches proportional to the population of the town? Is it, a bar? Well, yeah, maybe it's all of those things. But the real truth is, I could probably lose all of those things in a town that had a really great diner. And Lakeside, fortunately, has a really great diner. They were over the bridge now and entering the northwest side of the town. This is Main Street, said Mulligan. And this, he said, crossing Main Street and turning right, is the town square. Even in the winter, the town square was impressive, but Shannon knew that this place was meant to be seen in summer. It would be a riot of color, of poppies and irises and flowers of every kind, and the clump of birch trees in one corner would be a green and silver bower. Now it was a colorless place, beautiful in a skeletal way, the band shell empty, the fountain turned off for the winter, the brownstone city hall capped by white snow. And this, concluded Chad Mulligan, bringing the car to a stop outside a high glass-fronted old building on the west of the square, is Mabel's. He got out of the car, opened the rear door for Shadow. The two men put their heads down against the cold and the wind and hurried across the sidewalk into a warm room, fragrant with the smells of new-baked bread, of pastry and soup and bacon. The place was almost empty. Mulligan sat down at a table and Shadow sat opposite him. He suspected that Mulligan was doing this to get a feel for the stranger in town. Then again, the police chief might simply be what he appeared. Friendly, helpful, good. Right there at the bottom, right there in that last paragraph, we have exactly what I was referring to about this process of normalization, this process of integration. The place was almost empty. Mulligan sat down at the table. Shadow sat opposite him. He's sitting down voluntarily opposite the local chief of police. He suspected that Mulligan was doing this to get a feel for the stranger in town, because that is Shadow's experience. That is Shadow's history manifesting itself right here. Then again, the police chief might simply be what he appeared. Friendly, helpful, good. Here, the spell of Lakeside is being woven around Shadow. And it's a powerful spell, as it is, I'm sure, for all of us reading. Yes, as Angela says, he might seem what he appears. Yes, he might be exactly what he appears to be. And if that is true, then that challenges Shadow's understanding of the world. Shadow lives in a world of conmen and tricksters, and now, heaven help him, gods. He lives in a world that almost never appears to be what it is, and is almost never what it appears to be. But here, well, Lakeside is different. And he recognizes that even as they pass into the town square. He knows that this is a place meant to be seen in summer. How can he be so sure of that? It would be a riot of color, of poppies and irises and flowers of every kind. Well, he's seen town squares before, presumably, but this is an immediate reaction that speaks to qualities that Shadow himself does not possess. Shadow has never struck me as a man of particularly vivid visual imagination. And yet here, though the town square itself is beautiful in an austere, wintry kind of way, that is not what he envisions. He envisions the story that Lakeside wants to tell him. He envisions the illusion of Lakeside more readily than he envisions the reality of Lakeside. And that does not mean that the illusion of Lakeside is any less true. It doesn't mean that there is an element of fantasy here. But there certainly is an element of something, not supernatural, I suppose, in the regularly understood sense, but greater than the natural. Lakeside has an identity that is speaking to Shadow more eloquently than the reality of Lakeside. Yes, good. Sincerity, most suspicious, says Mitch. Absolutely fair. Yes. Good. Yes, yes, yes. Oh, Mitch is asking about the meetup at the House on the Rock. Yes, probably not anytime soon. We have been beset with car troubles here in Oklahoma, so I don't think we'll be making a road trip anytime immediately, but hopefully by the end of the summer, maybe early fall, we'll be able to take a trip up there. And when we do, don't worry, we'll put out the word and invite as many of you as possible, and everyone can show up, and we'll do the House on the Rock, which will be fabulous. Good, good. Excellent. All right. So this is our introduction to Mabel's, which is, of course, perfect. And then, as if this wasn't enough, Chan actually gives us a rundown of what it is that makes Lakeside. Let's see. This is very good of you, said Shadow. But shouldn't you be out catching criminals, not helping newcomers? Not that I'm complaining, you understand. Mabel chuckled. We all tell him that, she said. Mulligan shrugged. It's a good town, he said simply. Not much trouble. You'll always get someone speeding within city limits, which is a good thing, as traffic tickets pay my wages. Fridays, Saturday nights, you'll get some jerk who gets drunk and beats on a spouse, and that can go both ways, believe me, man and women. And I learned when I was out in the force in Green Bay, I'd rather attend a bank robbery than a domestic in a big city. But out here, things are quiet. They call me out when someone's locked their keys in their vehicle. Barking dogs. Every year there's a couple of high school kids caught with weed behind the bleachers. Biggest police case we had here in 5 years was when Dan Schwartz got drunk and shot up his own trailer. Then he went on the run down Main Street in his wheelchair, waving this darn shotgun, shouting that he would shoot anyone who got in his way, that no one would stop him from getting to the interstate. I think he was on his way to Washington to shoot the president. I still remember whenever I think of my Dan heading down, I still laugh whenever I think of Dan heading down the interstate in that wheelchair of his with a bumper sticker on the back. My juvenile delinquent is screwing your honor student. You remember, Mabel? She nodded, lips pursed. She did not seem to find it as funny as Mulligan did. What did you do? Asked Shadow. I talked to him. He gave me the shotgun, slept it off down at the jail. Dan's not a bad guy. He was just drunk and upset. So a couple of things immediately, of course. The first, that it's a good town. It's just a good town. There are worse things in the world than Lakeside. And yet, the story that Mulligan tells us here is not necessarily that innocent. And we're cued to understand that it is not that innocent because of Mabel's response. Mabel nodding, her lips pursed. She did not seem to find it as funny as Mulligan did. Mulligan here is also somewhat guilty of normalizing his experience of Lakeside. He too is somewhat under the spell of Lakeside. We don't know enough about Mabel to speculate about her past, but this place, this community, this town may be realer for her than it is for those from outside. Mulligan spent time in Green Bay. He'd rather attend a bank robbery than a domestic, in the big city. But here, these incidental details of small town life are almost quaint to him. They're almost cute. We are talking about an armed guy going down the street threatening to shoot people, apparently on his way to Washington to try and kill the president. Now, okay, he's not going to get that far. Okay, the story is slightly absurd. But there is a difference between seeing this story in a comedic way and understanding that this is a thing that happened in your town. And again, I think that line from Mabel is absolutely necessary, is absolutely vital. The first time I prepped this slide, I actually cut that last part off because I was focusing on the story itself. And then the more that I read it, I thought, no, that is not the key here. That is not what we're doing. As Elizabeth says here in the YouTube chat, Green Bay is only a big city to a guy from a very small town. Yes, yes. And Di says, but like all small towns, there's something dark under the surface. We'll get to all of that. Yes, I'm sure. I think it's impossible to read this chapter and believe that Lakeside is exactly what it appears to be. Certainly Shadow himself seems to be suggesting that there was something special about Lakeside, and Wednesday has given us those hints too. But yes, yes, good. All right. So we have this story and we have this account and we have the resolution, which also speaks to small town virtues and small town values. I talked to him. He gave me the shotgun, slept it off down at the jail. That's not a bad guy. He was just drunk and upset. This is human. This is personal. It doesn't matter what Dan did. What matters is how Mulligan has responded to him. Mulligan understands that he's a good man, that he's a decent guy, that he was drunk and upset, that he made a mistake, that he did these things which are not themselves good things, but which he has managed to reframe successfully as at least comedic things. But ultimately, this doesn't change who Dan Schwartz is. And there's something there too about the primacy of community, about the encompassing supportive nature of community, I suppose, that we are defined as people in this town, and the town therefore rises to meet us. The town therefore rises to support us. And we get hints of that throughout, because one of the interesting things that happens in this chapter that happens almost nowhere else in the book is that we get perspectives from different characters on each new character as they are introduced. We will talk, a couple of people will talk about Missy, and a couple of people will talk about Marguerite, and a couple of people will talk even about Chad or about Mabel. And we're getting these different perspectives that speak not just to individuality, Contrast this, for example, with our encounter with Sam earlier in the book, which was a one-on-one, connection. That was about Sam and about her story. No, here Gaiman is weaving together this community really rather beautifully and rather effortlessly. We're getting a sense not just of these individual characters, but of how they interconnect. And that is the crucial key to understanding Lakeside in its Gestalt state, Lakeside as an entity, more than just a town, more than just a community, Lakeside as a singular thing. We have to understand that from multiple perspectives within Lakeside, and we're given that effortlessly as we move through. All of this, of course, still working in counterpoint to that sharp-edged experiential detail of Shadow's dream right at the beginning of the chapter. So we've got this immediate tension between Shadow's expectation and Shadow's experience, and our understanding of Lakeside specifically, and Lakeside as an archetypal place, Lakeside the trope, I suppose, the quaint and queer small town. We're looking at all of these individual tensions, even the tension between the weather and the hospitality of Lakeside. This is a comfortable, warm, and welcoming place. I'm sure that if you asked 100 people to describe Lakeside using 3 adjectives, warm would come up more often than not, and yet it is also bitterly cold. It is actually antithetical to human life right now. If Shadow tried to walk home right now, he would die. That's just the way it is. So even as he is being welcomed in, there is a threat there. And it isn't an urgent threat, and it isn't even a sharp threat, but it is a deep, ancient, cold threat. And that, of course, is eminently purposeful. Yeah. Yes, good. Wildfire is asking, where is Green Bay? And Aaron is providing the answer, northeastern Wisconsin. I'm not sure I could have pinned it anywhere specifically in Wisconsin. Aaron, thank you for that. Presumably on the water, hence the bay, but I couldn't have gone any further than that. Aaron says, Chad does seem very invested in making sure Lakeside doesn't make waves. Yes, and again, we have here a tension between our understanding of I suppose, Mulligan's job as chief of police and his kind of role as resident of Laketown. That's very interesting, and we will ultimately circle back to that in a very powerful way. Yes, good. All right. Oh no, and Angela says the dream combined with the subtle darkness of Lakeside brings the lottery to mind. Oh boy, that's a heartbreaking comparison, Angela. Thank you for that. Yes. All right, let's keep moving on because we're about to start slipping into our identity here. Shadow has gone through this experience of naturalization. He has been welcomed first by Hinselman, of course, then by the community at large. He is comfortable here. His pace is slowing and yet deepening too. If you look at Shadow's dialogue, he is becoming not more expressive perhaps, but more thoughtfully expressive. And now, of course, he's going to start telling the story of who he is, and we'll see the weight that carries. So what do you do, Mr. Ainsel? Asked the chief of police. Big guy like you, what's your profession? Will you be practicing it in Lakeside? Shadow's heart began to pound, but his voice was steady. I work for my uncle. He buys and sells stuff all over the country. I just do the heavy lifting. Does he pay well? I'm family. He knows I'm not going to rip him off, and I'm learning a little about the trade on the way until I figure out what it is I really want to do. It was coming out of him with conviction, smooth as a snake. He knew everything about Big Mike Ainsel in that moment, and he liked Mike Ainsel. Mike Ainsel had none of the problems that Shadow had. Ainsel had never been married. Mike Ainsel had never been interrogated on a freight train by Mr. Wood and Mr. Stone. Televisions did not speak to Mike Ainsel. You want to see Lucy's tits? Asked a voice in his head. Mike Ainsel didn't have bad dreams or believe that there was a storm coming. As we're pulling now toward this understanding of Lakeside and of Mike's place within Lakeside, Shadow finds himself caught up in the story more rapidly than he expects. As we look there at his first response to Mulligan, I work for my uncle. He buys and sells stuff all over the country. I just do the heavy lifting. This is crisp and muscular prose. This is almost elemental prose. This is the kind of dialogue that we associate with Shadow Moon. This is the way that he has spoken throughout the book, with very, very few exceptions. This is Shadow. Family. He knows I'm not going to rip him off, and I'm learning a little about the trade on the way until I figure out what it is I really want to do. I'm family, first off. That could be a Shadow Moon line. It's certainly brief enough, but Shadow would never describe himself in those terms. I don't think that he would go to something so immediate and so personal so readily unless it had already begun to seep into his subconscious. And then he knows I'm not going to rip him off. acknowledging the possibility of conflict. There's nothing smooth, despite what he says about his relationship with his uncle. He knows I'm not going to rip him off. Knowing that you are not going to be ripped off by someone also acknowledges the possibility that that someone could rip you off. Knowing this is an act of certainty and belief more than it is an actual fact. But then I'm learning a little about the trade on the way until I figure out what it is I really want to do. And by this point, even he's aware of it. It was coming out of him with conviction, smooth as a snake. He knows this guy. And it's not just, though, the things that he lists. Well, let's look at this actually, because I think this is quite telling. Mike Ainsel had none of the problems that Shadow had. Okay. None of the shared problems none of the problems that Shadow has experienced and endured are shared by Mike Ainsel. So let's list those problems, shall we? Ainsel had never been married. Well, damn, Shadow. To go first to your marriage right now, and the betrayal and the loss and the return of your wife, this is harrowing. That's the first thing that he goes to. Ainsel had never been married. Mike Ainsel had never been interrogated on a freight train by Mr. Wood and Mr. Stone. Fair. This is a terrifying and unexpected and supernatural event. Televisions did not speak to Mike Ainsel. You want to see Lucy's tits? Asked a voice in his head, coming back to him, drawing back to him the echo of this experience, which is now less real to him, though it was a real experience. The echo of this experience, which is now less real to him than Lakeside itself. And then Mike Ainsel didn't have bad dreams or believe that there was a storm coming. So we start with the completely mundane. We rise into the dizzyingly, terrifyingly supernatural, which has been true of Shadow's experience, of course, but then we return to not just the mundane, though partially. We return to the intimate and the human. What would Shadow want right now? Well, to wish that he'd never been married, to wish that he wasn't dealing with either Laura's infidelity or her death or her return or whatever. Obviously not to be interrogated on a freight train by evil, weird spooks. Obviously not to have media talk to him through television screens. But ultimately, not to have bad dreams and not to believe that there was a storm coming. We see here a perfect transition, I think, from something that is almost 100% Shadow to something that is almost 100% Mike. Because the thoughts that are disquieting Shadow become personal, become completely intimate. Bad dreams and a belief that a storm is coming, those are not actually real problems. Those are not actually real things that you have to fight against, particularly in the span of a few weeks in which Shadow has been fighting against very real things. Shadow's life has been in danger. He has literally seen things that beggar belief, literally seen things that baffle his mind, that challenge his understanding of the world. He has seen all of this. He knows that there's a war coming, but it's not the war that he thinks of. It's the storm that's on the way. That, to me, definitely speaks to that transition and pulls us back again into Mike and Shadow's desire in this moment to be different. And I do think that there's a degree to which Shadow is seeking an escape from his life. I absolutely agree that there's a degree to which the story itself is drawing him in. When you tell a story, that story begins to occupy a certain amount of space. It has a weight and it has a mass, and mass exerts gravity. We are drawn to stories, and the more powerful the story, the greater the mass of the story, the more we are drawn to it, the more we are pulled inside it, past the event horizon of this narrative black hole, and then we're inside it. And that can change fundamentally who we are. Doesn't usually in real life change the outside world, though fantasy stories allow us to treat that with a little more mutability than we otherwise would. But Shadow here is falling into Mike, if you like. Yeah. Let me see. Yes. Aaron says he claims he can do coin tricks and not the con needed in stage magic, but Shadow has more than a little skill with conning. Also, he did this before when he answered the phone as Wednesday's boss during the bank job. Yes, he absolutely did. What's crucial about that distinction, I think, is that when he answers the phone during the bank heist, and he finds himself, as Aaron points out absolutely correctly here, he finds himself slipping into the role. He finds himself warming to the role. He's taking a kind of reflexive, self-aware delight in the con itself. He is aware that he is slipping into the role, and he is pleased with the job that he's doing. Here, he seems a little surprised by it. It was coming out of him with conviction, smooth as a snake. It was coming out of him. He's not doing it. He doesn't seem to be thrilled. And we know that he's not concerned about the lie per se, because this isn't about just trying to convince Mulligan. It's also about who he is. It's about the story that he's telling. He knew everything about big Mike Ainsel in that moment, and he liked Mike Ainsel. This is about a desire. There's something more happening here in Lakeside. Yes, good. Good. All right. Speaking of stories, speaking of characters, speaking of representation here in the pages of American Gods, we absolutely have to talk a little about Missy. I have quoted this entire slide. This is, I mean, I can't go longer than this. Let me share the slide with you. You will see why I can never run a longer slide than this without making the text smaller, but this is about as good as it gets. And this is beautiful. And I will just prime you right up front. Notice that we get no attributed dialogue from Missy. No direct quotations of what Missy says. Missy's force of personality, her command of her own language is so forceful that it inserts itself within the prose frame of the novel. Her dialogue is not offset. Her dialogue swamps the actual prose of the book. Missy drove Shadow back to her place, where in the drive he saw an elderly SUV. The blown snow had bleached half of it to a blinding white, while the rest of it was painted the kind of drippy purple that someone would need to be very stoned very often to even begin to be able to find attractive. Still, the car started up on the first try, and the heater worked, although it took almost 10 minutes of running the engine with the heater on full before it even started to change the interior of the car from unbearably cold to merely chilly. While this was happening, Missy Gunther took Shadow into her kitchen. Excuse the mess, but the little ones just leave their toys all over after Christmas, and she doesn't have the heart. Would you care for some leftover turkey dinner? Last year they did goose, but this year it was a big old turkey. Well, coffee then. Won't take a moment to brew a fresh pot. And Shadow took a large red toy car off the window seat and sat down, while Missy Gunther asked if he had met his neighbors yet, and Shadow confessed that he hadn't. There were, he was informed, while the coffee dripped and brewed, 4 other inhabitants of his apartment building. Back when it was the Pilson place, the Pilsons lived in the downstairs flat and rented out the upper 2 flats. Now their apartment. That was their apartment. That was the downstairs one, and that was taken by a couple of young men, Mr. Holtz and Mr. Neiman. They actually are a couple. And when she said couple, Mr. Ansel, heavens, we have all kinds here, more than one kind of tree in the forest. Although mostly those kind of people wind up in Madison or the Twin Cities. But truth to tell, nobody here gives it a second thought. They're in Key West for the winter. They'll be back in April. He'll meet them then. The thing about Lakeside is it's a good town. Now next door to Mr. Ansel, that's Marguerite Olson and her little boy. A sweet lady, sweet, sweet lady, but she's had a hard life. Still sweet as pie, and she works for the Lakeside News, not the most exciting newspaper in the world, but truth to tell, Missy Gunther thought that this was probably the way most people, this was probably the way most folk around here liked it. Oh, she said, and poured him coffee. She just wished that Mr. Ansel would come see the town in the summer or late in the spring when the lilacs and the apple and the cherry blossoms were out. She thought there was nothing like it for beauty, nothing like it anywhere in the world. Aaron is calling out here too. Yes, flats. Gaiman's Britishness is peeking through. I wondered about that. I was willing to give that the benefit of the doubt and assume that that is perhaps an odd remnant of Wisconsin dialect, that perhaps in Wisconsin they also use flats as an alternate word. But yes, it did stand out to me when I read it. Yeah, you're absolutely right. This is just staggering. This is just beautiful. As Mitch calls out, anyone from the Midwest knows this woman. Yes. As Becca says, I love this woman. She's so fun. I want to have her over for coffee. And this is the experience. This is, because in a sense, the narrative is shifting to give us an excellent sense of Missy Gunther's voice. But what we really are is in Shadow's POV. Here we are being overcome. The tidal wave that is Missy Gunther is just washing over us, and we are being buoyed along by it. That's true because, in part, we get these brief accounts to the side. And we're already moving into this right there in that first short paragraph. The kind of drippy purple that someone would need to be very stoned very often to even begin to be able to find attractive. Geez, could we pack some more qualifiers and modifiers into that sentence, please? Then when we go into the kitchen, we get the beat of Shadow. Shadow took a large red toy car off the window and sat down, while Missy Gunther asked if he had met his neighbors yet, and Shadow confessed that he hadn't. No attributed dialogue from Shadow either. He is so caught up in this social maelstrom, this social whirlwind, that he himself can't speak. He himself doesn't speak. It's just a fantastic piece. This is one of those elements that has, I mean, there are a few extremely remote connections to the plot contained within the sequence, but really this is just a character piece. Really, this is just Gaiman, I think, genuinely delighting in, I'm sure, experiences that he had in real life as he spent time in Wisconsin and in the upper Midwest. I love it. Hurricane Missy, says Becca. Yes. Good. Good. I just love it. And we are also foreshadowing a few details there that will be necessary. Yes. Good. So Shadow returns to his apartment, and Hinzelman comes and drops off the welcome basket, shares a few stories. I didn't pull any slides from Hinzelman this time, as much as we love him, because, well, there are already so many slides for this chapter, and we have a few other things to talk about. But eventually we will have, there's a moth flying around as I'm trying to do a podcast, which frankly is just disrespectful. There'll be plenty of opportunity to talk about Hinzelman more directly. And when we do, I will come back to these stories. But these stories, bereft of frame, bereft of context, these stories as Lakeside stories are at least incomplete. So I want to circle back around to some of the foreshadowing when we get to the point that we learn more about Hinzelman and learn more about Lakeside. So after Hinzelman leaves, Shadow finds that it is still freezing cold in his apartment, goes next door to Marguerite Olsen and introduces himself. Let me show you the slide here. Marguerite Olsen, good to meet you, said Shadow. He pulled off a glove and they shook hands. You know, ma'am, I'd always thought of Olsen's as being blonder than you. My ex-husband was as blonde as they come. Pink and blonde, couldn't tan at gunpoint. Missy Gunther told me you ran for the local paper. Missy Gunther tells everybody everything. I don't see why we need a local paper with Missy Gunther around. She nodded. Yes, some news reporting here and there, but my editor writes most of the news. I write the nature column, the gardening column, an opinion column every Sunday, and the news from the community column, which tells in mind-numbing detail who went to dinner with who for 15 miles around. Or is that whom? Whom, said Shadow before he could stop himself. It's the objective case. She looked at him with her black eyes, and Shadow experienced a moment of pure déjà vu. I've been here before, he thought. No, she reminds me of someone. The beat here of Shadow correcting, or I guess not correcting as much as clarifying Marguerite Olsen's grammar, makes me extremely happy. Not least of all because I am a big fan of the pedantic rules of grammar, but also because she is a writer for the local paper. She is a writer for the local paper and doesn't know the objective case. Shadow corrects her. But this is perfect. This is not indicative of any lack of talent or skill from Marguerite Olsen. Rather, it is a nod towards the kind of paper that we have here in Lakeside. The people of Lakeside do not care about the objective case. The people of Lakeside do not care about such formality. What they want is exactly what she describes. Some news reporting here and there, but my editor writes most of the news. I write the nature column, the gardening column, an opinion column every Sunday, and the news from the community column, which tells in mind-numbing detail who went to dinner with who for 15 miles around. That is what the local paper is for, because the local paper is not primarily in the business of delivering news to the community. It is not primarily in the business of changing the community or informing the community, which God knows amount to the same thing. What it is really about is about affirming the community. The nature column, the gardening column, an opinion column every Sunday, which certainly could well stand in as a sermon in a book that is kind of conspicuously, avoids conspicuously references to, conventional religion and faith. And then the news from the community column. This is what it is for. In mind-numbing detail, Marguerite Olsen says. Though, crucially, of course, Marguerite Olsen, not from here. Marguerite Olsen is not an Olsen in the sense that she is pink and blonde and couldn't tan at gunpoint. She has married into this community. So her priorities are a little different. Yeah. Jonathan says it could also be game in reestablishing that Shadow is smarter than he usually lets on. Absolutely. Both. And Jonathan clarifies, but he's letting Mike be outwardly more expressive of his knowledge. That's actually beautiful, Jonathan. Yes. Great catch. I hadn't thought of that, but you're right. Shadow is this smart, and we know that Shadow is this smart, but you're right. He's allowing Mike to be publicly smart in a way that he himself usually isn't. That's a very, very good catch. Good. Yes. Oh, and Aaron's asking, this is good. This is exactly the kind of thought I'm sure that Shadow would have or would have had if he'd met her first when he came into town. Aaron asks, is it that she doesn't know, or is she testing him? I rather like that too. Yeah. Edward asks here in the YouTube chat, Shadow is more street smart, but is he formally educated? Well, Shadow, we know, read a lot in prison. We know that he has improved his mind, and he is certainly, it takes a certain amount of formal literacy to enjoy Herodotus. So presumably he is fairly widely read and is at least well-versed in the rules of grammar. So I think here, I think Jonathan may well have put his finger directly on it. That's a great insight. Yes, I buy completely that Shadow is this smart, but it's interesting that he's letting Mike express that intelligence and that I guess, education as distinct from intelligence. Yeah, good. Okay. Goodness me, I still have a number of slides to get through, you guys. Okay. And we haven't even hit the most important parts here. Let's do it. Okay, so shortly after this, Marguerite tells Shadow how to insulate his apartment so that it can be more habitable. And of course, in the insulation of the apartment, it is crucial that he doesn't read about this. It is crucial that he doesn't simply figure it out himself. He doesn't go to the hardware store and buy one of whatever they have to insulate his home. I mean, he does, but only after Marguerite has suggested it, because here, his experience of Lakeside is once again being normalized by human connection. Marguerite is literally, through a one-to-one personal relationship, making his home habitable. She is sealing out the inhospitable winter and creating for him a place, creating for him a home. And then he goes and actually does it, but it's informed by Marguerite's personal connection. And then, of course, just as he's getting settled, just as life is getting comfortable for good old Mike Ainsel, Shadow is approached by Wednesday. What am I doing here? Asked Shadow. In Lakeside, I mean, not in the world. Wednesday smiled his smile, the one that made Shadow want to hit him. You're living here because it's the last place to look for you. I can keep you out of sight here. By they, you mean the Black Hands? Exactly. I'm afraid the house on the rock is now out of bounds. It's a little difficult, but we'll cope. Now it's just stamping our feet and flag waving, caracole and saunter until the action starts a little later than any of us expected. I think they'll hold off until spring. Nothing big can happen until then. How come? Because they may babble on about micromilliseconds and virtual worlds and paradigm shifts and what have you. They still inhabit this planet, and they're still bound by the cycle of the year. These are the dead months. A victory in these months is a dead victory. I have no idea what you're talking about, said Shadow. That was not entirely true. He had a vague idea, and he hoped it was wrong. It's going to be a bad winter, and you and I are going to use our time as wisely as we can. We shall rally our troops and pick our battleground. The open question here, I suppose. What is the vague thought that Shadow has? He had a vague idea, and he hoped it was wrong. What is that thought? What does Wednesday mean when he says a victory in these months is a dead victory? Is he speaking metaphorically? Well, presumably, possibly, gods speak in metaphor. They speak in symbolism, but this seems a little more direct. Is there another force that is governing the pace of this? Yes. Wildfire says in the YouTube chat, the urge to hit Wednesday. I'm sure that's not too uncommon. Yes, correct. Oh, and Becker's calling out that Marguerite's tips are actual tips, and I appreciate that. Isn't that great? Isn't that wonderful? I mean, upstate New York was no upstate Wisconsin, but still, I recognize some of those tips as necessary. Yes. Yes, absolutely right. Good. Aaron says, looks like Wednesday could use a winter soldier. Who the hell is Bucky? That's the question we're all still asking all these months later. Yes. And Becca says, love these dead months, so very connected to the earth and so many cultures. Yes, this is what speaks to me, is this cycle of life and death, this idea that in the spring we will be reborn, the world will be reborn. It's not just that these are difficult months. It's not just that these are hard months. These are dead months. But in the spring, they will live again. And in the summer, they will fight again, because that is what life does. That constant, riotous rush toward experience that defines all life, that is going to happen again. And it is going to happen to the gods too. And then terrible things are coming in. Aaron says that Bucky could be Tyr, the one-handed god. That's fair. That's fair. Yes. Angela says, Shadow felt he recognized something in Marguerite too. Yes, that's actually a specific something. I don't want to foreshadow that, because the reveal when it comes along is very nice. That's less being in Lakeside and less, god magic, and more a personal experience. Yes. Jonathan says, in the spring we go a Viking. It's the best time to Vike, really, the spring, I think. Some people insist on summer Viking, but I'm not so sure about it. Yes, good, good. So what is it that we're talking about here? What am I doing here as Shadow in Lakeside? I mean, not in the world. And let's pause there. Because who says in the world? Is that Shadow? Because when I read that, I hear Mike Ainsel. What am I doing here as Shadow in Lakeside? I mean, not in the world. Ha, funny joke. Funny, wry, ironic joke that I just made. Yeah, that reads to me like Mike. You're living here, Wednesday replies, because this is the last place to look for you. I can keep you out of sight here. There is something special about Lakeside. Wednesday has already suggested as much before he packed Shadow on the bus to Lakeside in the first place, but this is further confirmation. Lakeside is somehow special. It is somehow more than it appears. And given the details that we've noted as we're moving through the town in the course of this chapter, it feels as though one of the things that sets Lakeside apart is its archetypal nature. It is every bit as elemental as Shadow himself is. And that's yeah, pretty wild. Yes, good. Angela says, I really try not to read ahead, but I might because I keep foreshadowing without meaning to. That's all right. That's all right. Yes. And Wildfire says, I actually found that to be a little bit dark. Like, why am I in the world? Yes. I think there's a part of that too. This may simply be in Lakeside. I mean, not in the world, because I'm thinking about the world. That's another possible interpretation, I think, is that Shadow is clarifying the question because actually both of those questions are rather urgent to him right now, are rather pressing on him right now. And then we get this wonderful counterpoint between the old gods and the new, because they may babble on about micromilliseconds and virtual worlds and paradigm shifts and what have you, but they still inhabit this planet and are still bound by the cycle of the year. It doesn't matter how you seek to redefine yourself, you are still bound by your context. You are still bound by your home and by your community, even as Shadow is now bound by Lakeside. It is impossible for him to be entirely un-Lakeside within Lakeside, just as it was impossible for him to be entirely un-Eagle Point within Eagle Point. And we talked too about the ways that Chernobog and the Zarias kind of took on Chicago into themselves and in turn defined their community too. And that, of course, is the reciprocity of community. Yes, Mike Ainsel is partly defined by Lakeside, but he too defines Lakeside by his presence, by his actions, by his presence in that complicated web of relationships. Yeah. Yes, Jonathan says here, since Shadow emerged from prison, he's felt uneasy about being back in the world, frequently referenced by people spending time in prison. Yes, absolutely. Good. Angela asks, was Second Life in existence yet when American Gods was published? Yes. Second Life came along. Perhaps not Second Life, actually. But certainly the direct antecedents of Second Life would have been around, yes. There were consensual virtual worlds going back to the early 1990s, even the late 1980s in text, but yeah. Yeah, oh, Mitch is clarifying. 2003 for Second Life. Wow, that's a little later than I would have expected, actually. That's surprising. But yes, the direct antecedents, there were virtual worlds. There were, we'd already gone through the first... Gosh, we'd already gone through the first 2 waves of virtual reality technology by that point. The first 2 failed attempts to make virtual reality a thing. Give it up, you guys. It's never going to be a thing. It's fine. And yes, as Aaron's saying, this book came out when EverQuest was new. Yes. Yes. The Sims was, absolutely. Yes. The Sims and SimCity, of course, had already had, SimCity had already been around for what, 12, 14 years by that point. So yes, absolutely. Good. Yeah. Muds and EverQuest was just showing up, as Jonathan Nash confirms here. The Virtual Boy, says Mitch. Oh, the Virtual Boy. I kind of want a Virtual Boy. If you guys don't know, Virtual Boy was a complete misfire of a product from Nintendo. And you now, to the best of my knowledge, can't get one without spending an extortionate amount of money. They are awful and painful to use. I have used one once. Not great, but I kind of want one nonetheless. Which, of course, that may have sounded like a tangent, but here I'm going to make it actually relevant, which, of course, speaks exactly to Wednesday's point. Because the baubles of technology, the buzzwords and the concepts that drive progress forward and certainly constrain and define that progress as it is occurring, all of those words don't change a thing. Because we are still bound by the cycle of the planet, because we are still bound in our bodies and our physical geography. We are still limited by the crudest kind of reality, as Shadow is in Lakeside. I mean, this is kind of a reflection. In a sense, as the God War whatever this coming storm is, as it is limited by these dead months. So Shadow himself was limited by the cold of this winter. He couldn't move around the way that he wanted to. He was restricted and has now to wait, even as he's waiting for Wednesday. Good. Okay, we still have a few slides to get to, and we absolutely have to get to Vegas, which is where we are going next, into one of the odder, more unusual segments in the book. Entering the casino, one is beset at every side by invitation. Invitations such that it would take a man of stone, heartless, mindless, and curiously devoid of avarice to decline them. Listen. A machine gun rattle of silver coins as they tumble and spurt down into a slot machine tray and overflow into monogrammed carpets is replaced by the siren clangor of the slots, the jangling, blippiting chorus swallowed by the huge room, muted to a comforting background chatter by the time one reaches the card tables, the distant sounds only loud enough to keep the adrenaline flowing through the gambler's veins. There is a secret that the casinos possess, a secret they hold and guard and prize, the holiest of their mysteries. For most people do not gamble to win money, after all, although that is what is advertised, sold, claimed, and dreamed. But that is merely the easy lie that allows the gamblers to lie to themselves, the big lie that gets them through the enormous, ever-open, welcoming doors. The secret is this. People gamble to lose money. They come to the casinos for the moment in which they feel alive, to ride the spinning wheel and turn with the cards and lose themselves with the coins and the slots. They want to know they matter. They may brag about the nights they won, the money they took from the casino, but they treasure, secretly treasure, the times they lost. It's a sacrifice of sorts. So this is our introduction to Vegas. Vegas as Gaiman sees it, Vegas as presumably by proxy Shadow sees it, the Vegas that exists within the American Gods universe, the Vegas that is, well, the ultimate roadside attraction. Angela's being very coy here in the YouTube chat. Vegas to see who? Wait, to see who? Wait, who? We've no idea. We've just no idea who or what happened, I suppose. We can't even remember. Yes. Becca says casinos are like tar pits for some folks, and I love the picture he paints. Yes, and this is going to, we'll talk about this when we get to it, but much, much later, Wednesday is going to list his charms, and the final charm that he will list is going to call back directly to this passage, because he's going to talk about the importance of a secret that no one else knows. And this is that secret. We'll tell you that you're coming here to win. You'll agree that you're coming here to win, but secretly, we know the truth. Secretly, you're coming here to lose yourself in the sacrifice, to lose yourself and perhaps even find yourself in the loss. And Jonathan Nash is calling out here, Vegas is a really interesting city, especially when you visit places off the strip. I am certain that is true. I'm absolutely certain that that is true. The Vegas that is represented to us here is not real Vegas. It is heightened Vegas. It is no more Vegas than, well, than Lakeside is Lakeside, I suppose. Yes. Vegas is the ultimate roadside attraction, says Angela Lurie. Yes, precisely. So here we see the ushering in of the gamblers. Here we see the roulette wheels turning like prayer wheels. Here we see the chattered mantras of faith and belief and hope, the want and the need and the relief that can come with the loss, the giving up of things. We are definitely painting Vegas here as, well, as a con man's temple. It is absolutely a temple. It is, by the rules of American Gods, completely offering acts of worship, acts of sacrifice, but it is not transparent. It is not true. Let's look at the next. Look, says the bearded man, knocking back his Jack Daniels. You come in, be there when we need you, and I'll take care of you. What do you want? Soma? I can get you a bottle of Soma. The real stuff. The man in the dark suit stares. Then he nods his head reluctantly and makes a comment. Of course I am, says the bearded man, smiling like a knife. What do you expect? But look at it this way, it's the only game in town. He reaches out a paw-like hand and shakes the other man's well-manicured hand. Then he walks away. The thin waitress comes over, puzzled. There's now only one man at the corner table, a sharply dressed man with dark hair and a charcoal gray suit. You doing okay? She asks. Is your friend coming back? The man with the dark hair sighs and explains that his friend won't be coming back, and thus she won't be paid for her time or for her trouble. And then, seeing the hurt in her eyes and taking pity on her, he examines the golden threads in his mind, watches the Matrix, follows the money until he spots a node, and tells her that if she's outside Treasure Island at 6 a.m., 30 minutes after she gets off work, she'll meet an oncologist from Denver who will have just won $40,000 at a craps table and will need a mentor, a partner, someone to help him dispose of it all in the 48 hours before he gets on that plane home. The words evaporate in the waitress's mind, but they leave her happy. She sighs and notes that the guys in the corner have done a runner and have not even tipped her. And it occurs to her that instead of driving straight home when she gets off shift, she's going to drive over to Treasure Island. But she would never, if you asked her, be able to tell you why. The beauty of Gaiman's prose here, the mastery of his perspective here is striking, is just utterly, utterly compelling. Shadow has met this figure before. We must remember, at the house at the Rock. We know for sure that there was a figure that Shadow could not later remember, and it seems very likely, at least, that this is the same figure. And, okay, let's get into the specifics for just a moment. There is some speculation online about the identity of this forgotten god, who this person is, this person who can delve into this matrix, who can see the golden threads of money and predict their outcome. We're curious about the identity of this figure. And close analysis of the text suggests that this figure may be some version of Mercury, which is itself fascinating because one of the many qualities possessed by Odin is that if you do a pantheistic match by match, then Odin also is kind of representative of Mercury. This is certainly possible, but I think that trying to match this forgotten god to the existing pantheon around the world, the pantheon of real life religions, I think may be missing the point. This god is Vegas. And I genuinely think that one of the reasons that we can't recall who he is or what he says or any details about him is that Vegas itself, the experience of Vegas, I suppose I should say, and again, not talking about the city, not talking about the community, talking about the strip, I suppose, but the experience of Vegas is the unformed blur. You are left with the afterglow and not perhaps with the detail. And that isn't just a function of alcohol. It isn't just a function of overindulgence. It's also a function of just sensory stimulation, sensory saturation, I suppose. You are triggered and driven in every possible direction simultaneously, and you are left ultimately without. And thus the detail of the knowledge passes from your mind, but the general sense of it remains. As Elizabeth says here in the YouTube chat, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Yes. Yes, Jonathan calls out here a forgotten god who specifically doesn't lose power by being forgotten. This is part of the detail, I think, that because the forgotten god isn't completely forgotten. His presence endures. It remains. And also we should talk about the Soma. I forget now. I do, in fact. Let's move right on to the next slide and we'll kind of tie this in. So he's in, said Wednesday. It'll cost me a bottle of Soma, though. What's Soma? It's a drink. They walked onto the charter plane, empty but for them and the trio of corporate big spenders who needed to be back in Chicago by the start of the next business day. Wednesday got comfortable, ordered himself a Jack Daniels. My kind of people see your kind of people. He hesitated. It's like bees and honey. Each bee makes only a tiny, tiny drop of honey. It takes thousands of them, millions perhaps, all working together to make that pot of honey you have on your breakfast table. Now imagine that you could eat nothing but honey. That's what it's like for my kind of people. We feed on belief, on prayers, on love. It takes a lot of people believing just the tiniest bit to sustain us. That's what we need instead of food. Belief. And Soma is, to take the analogy further, it's honey wine. Mead. He chuckled. It's a drink. Concentrated prayer and belief distilled into a potent liquor. This is perhaps the solution to the conundrum of believing in the forgotten god, that he is sustained entirely by Soma, that his belief has been disassociated, which is, of course, perfect for the god of Vegas, the god of the strip, if you like, because Vegas itself cannot sustain. The strip itself cannot sustain. Without people coming in from outside, the strip wouldn't exist. It is a tourist attraction, and like all tourist attractions, it requires the rest of the world to exist in order to continue to function. And so, in effect, does the god of the strip. He cannot be sustained by where he is. He cannot even be sustained by what he is. He has to be sustained by the infusion of belief from other sources, artificial sources. Yeah. Okay, let me see. Fun fact, says Hope, Soma is also a muscle relaxer, I think. Really? Really? Huh. That's a terrifying thing. Good. Jonathan says, I've always thought Hades or Pluto would work better than Mercury because they both have aspects of invisibility in their myths. Yet one of the wrinkles in thinking Hades or Pluto is that Gaiman has specifically said in the past that there are no Greek or Roman gods in American gods. And of course, I know you're all shining foul about Mercury, but Mercury also exists in Hindu traditions. So that's the version of Mercury that they're referencing when they've kind of put all the pieces together to make that work. But yes, good. If this is interesting. Mitch says, if the forgotten god is made of the strip, why is he not a new god? This is something that we're going to get to discuss in the chapters to come. What differentiates the new god from the old? And it is possible. I'm very casually using the god of the strip here as though that means something. But he could be the god of gambling. Every time someone sits down to, back to the oldest prehistory when two hairy, fur-wrapped people sat around a campfire and rolled bones. And one of them muttered some oath beneath their breath as the roll came up good or came up bad. Perhaps that is it. Perhaps it is the god of the gamble. Perhaps it is the god of chance, even the god of luck. Yes. Maybe it's just, as Aaron says here, that luck is elusive. Good. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Hope says also, I think I read somewhere that Gaiman was going to tell people who this was until a fan asked him not to. Yeah, there are a couple of versions of this story. That is one of my favorites. One of my favorites is exactly that. The Gaiman was going to tell everyone who this god was just going to reveal the identity, but then received a letter from a fan saying, no, I'm loving the mystery so much, please never do it. And apparently Gaiman somewhat willfully agreed that he wouldn't. There are other versions of the story too. Gaiman also talks very eloquently about the difference in world building, the difference in storytelling, I suppose, between the pre-internet and post-internet eras, or post-internet, the pre-internet and internet eras. That in the days before the internet, if a fan wrote to him and asked him a question about Sandman, for example, his comic series, he would just answer it. No matter how obscure that piece of information was, he would just answer it. If someone wrote to him and said, okay, but really, you've been setting up this mystery for 2 years. What's the answer? Who did this thing? He would just tell them. Because where's the harm? They would have no means of disseminating that information. They might tell a handful of people at their local comic shop, but it wouldn't change the experience of the story for the vast majority of people. Now, in the days of the internet, he has a blanket policy that he won't answer those questions. He won't explain his work, because to explain his work is to begin to create a kind of companion volume, a kind of almost kind of textual errata accompanying the book itself, so that you read American Gods and then you go on the American Gods wiki and you find out what's really going on, and that's not an experience that he wants to have. So he's kind of trying to preserve that by simply not talking about this stuff. He also has said that there's a possibility that, let me frame this as carefully as he did. If he knew for sure that he was never going to tell the story of this god, then he would reveal the identity of the god, which I find fascinating. The story of this god is one that I would definitely want to read. Good. Yes. Aaron is asking if you feel like going down a wiki not asking, rather saying, if you feel like going down a wiki wormhole, I do suggest the Greek Hindu syncretism of the syncretism of the Bactrian culture. Amazing stuff. That does sound amazing, Aaron. I will definitely check that out. Yes. Yes. Good. Yes, Angela says, I love keeping the mystery in this day and age. And Jonathan says, aiding in death of the author, as it were. Absolutely. He's creating this permissive space. In many ways, okay, in this particular regard, I will draw with no more, or I will paint with no more broad a brush than that. But in this particular regard, Neil Gaiman is kind of the anti-J.K. Rowling, who has absolutely taken that line, that if you have a question, ask me. And if I see your question and I'm in the mood to answer it, I will answer it definitively and canonically, and that will be it. The entire weight of authorial authority will be with it. Yeah. Good. Okay. Let's keep going. Now we've dealt with Soma. We're going to take, okay. It's 9:15 here in Oklahoma City, and I have 4 slides left, and they're all pretty dense. So let's see what we can do to get through them. We're going to begin by looking at Wednesday's charms. Wednesday said nothing for long enough that Shadow started to wonder if he had heard the question, or if he had possibly fallen asleep with his eyes open. Then he said, staring ahead of him as he talked, I know a charm that can cure pain and sickness and lift the grief from the heart of the grieving. I know a charm that will heal with a touch. I know a charm that will turn aside the weapons of an enemy. I know another charm to free myself from all bonds and locks. A fifth charm. I can catch a bullet in flight and take no harm from it. His words were quiet, urgent. Gone was the hectoring tone. Gone was the grin. Wednesday spoke as if he were reciting the words of a religious ritual, as if he were speaking something dark and painful. A sixth. Spells sent to hurt me will hurt only the sender. A seventh charm, I know. I can quench a fire simply by looking at it. An eighth. If any man hates me, I can win his friendship. A ninth. I can sing the wind to sleep and calm a storm for long enough to bring a ship to shore. Those were the first 9 charms I learned. 9 nights I hung on the bare tree, my side pierced with a spear's point. I swayed and blew in the cold winds and the hot winds without food, without water, a sacrifice of myself to myself, and the worlds opened to me. So most charms here are taking the form of magical abilities. Most charms here are taking the form of actual tricks that he can do. Heal with a touch, free myself from bonds and locks, quench a fire simply by looking at it. But there are a couple which don't quite work that way. A sixth, spells sent to hurt me will hurt only the sender. That doesn't feel like a charm as much as that's an ever-present effect. That is what we video gamers would call a status effect. An eighth, if any man hates me, I can win his friendship. By means of that charm, or is this simply a loophole? How far do we have to drive a man into hate before he immediately begins to, well, presumably like you again? And then we get the story, a brief account of the story of Odin hanging on Yggdrasil, pierced with his spear, the sacrifice of myself to myself. Aaron says, the 8th charm. He forces producers to cast Ian McShane in his role. Yes, excellent. Good, good. Onward. For a 10th charm, I learned to dispel witches, to spin them around in the sky so they will never find their way back to their own doors again. An 11th. If I sing it when a battle rages, it can take warriors through the tumult unscathed and unhurt and bring them safely back to their hearth and their home. A 12th charm, I know. If I see a hanged man, I can bring him down from the gallows to whisper to us all he remembers. A 13th. If I sprinkle water on a child's head, that child will not fall in battle. A 14th. I know the names of all the gods, every damned one of them. A 15th. I have a dream of power, of glory, and of wisdom, and I can make people believe my dreams. His voice was so low now that Shadow had to strain to hear it over the plane's engine noise. A 16th charm, I know. If I need love, I can turn the mind and heart of any woman. A 17th. That no woman I want will ever want another. And I know an 18th charm, and that charm is the greatest of all, and that charm I can tell to no man, for a secret that no one knows but you is the most powerful secret there can ever be. Here we get the shape, the geometry of Wednesday. Here we get, I think, in a very real sense, the dimensionality of Wednesday. To describe these charms is, in part, to describe who he is. In the sense of Odin, of course, in the sense of, all of his many different identities and many different names, but also, crucially, in the sense of Wednesday himself. Some of these are fascinating. I'm running out of time and I can't do the close textual read that I would really like to, but some of these are fascinating in that they come with particular conditions. The 16th charm, I know, if I need love, I can turn the mind and heart of any woman. If I need love. What does that mean? Does this mean that I can do this if I need love, or I can do it all the time and only would do it if I needed love? A 17th, that no woman I want will ever want another. Well, isn't that almost the same? Doesn't that feel as though there's an overlap there with the 16th? It's possible, yes. And Mitch says, the fact he knows all the names of the gods gives me pause for a moment. In universe which creation myth is the true creation myth, is it all of them or none of them or something else completely? That is a fascinating question. Yes. Well, first the universe was created. Then came human beings. Then human beings started telling stories. Now those stories are true in a sense. They are true enough to empower gods, but that is the sequence of events. First, you have the universe, then you have people, then you have stories, then you have gods. The universe has to have been created naturally. It can't have been created by a god, because that god would not have existed when the universe was created. Unless there is another god. Unless all of the gods of American gods, and this is something that I've been thinking about with regard to the TV show adaptation too, and certain lines of dialogue which are a little more emphatic than you would otherwise expect them to be. And certainly if you've been watching the TV show, the character of Salim is giving a really interesting perspective on a kind of pure monotheistic faith. I think it is also possible to conclude that there is a god, a Christian god, a Muslim god, a Jewish god, some kind of monotheistic creator god. But there are also these pantheistic lowercase g gods, these demigods, effectively, these spirits and supernatural entities. These are created by belief, but the actual creator god is not. There's really not enough evidence to support that at this point in the text, and there's certainly not enough evidence to support that in the TV show, but it is a possible resolution to exactly that conundrum, Mitch. Yes, good. Oh, Becca's calling out, Salim is my love. I want so much more of him. Salim is the greatest. If you guys haven't been watching the TV show and you remember Salim from the very brief interlude with the Ifrit, they do a really good job of that story, you guys. They do a beautiful job of expanding that story. It's just my favorite. Yes, good. Okay, we really must move on because I really must wrap up, and we still have to talk about Laura, and then we have to close out the chapter, you guys. It's a long one. Aaron says they are little gods then? It makes sense in this universe. Yes, exactly. They are small gods, if you like. I think that's certainly a possible interpretation, and I do know that there are people of faith who are able to enjoy American gods while kind of having it be compatible with their own belief system. That American gods does not necessarily conflict with the existence of a monotheistic creator god, a monotheistic creator deity. Yes, yeah. Chibi gods, asks Mitch? Possibly. So this moves on to the sequence between Shadow and Wednesday, of course. And Aaron calls out here in the YouTube chat because someone had to. After all, we all know that the actual universe is the Song of Iluvatar. Yes, yes. We all believe in the Aina Lindale. Yes, good. Laura was all he said. Wednesday turned his head, stared into Shadow's pale gray eyes with his own. I can't make her live again, he said. I don't even know why she isn't as dead as she ought to be. I think I did it, said Shadow. It was my fault. Wednesday raised a bushy eyebrow. Matt Sweeney gave me a golden coin back when he showed me how to do that trick. From what he said, he gave me the wrong coin. What he gave me was something more powerful than what he thought he was giving me. I passed it on to Laura. Wednesday grunted, lowered his chin to his chest, frowned. Then he sat back. I can do it, he said. And no, I can't help you. What you do in your own time is your own affair, of course. What, asked Shadow, is that supposed to mean? It means that I can't stop you from hunting eagle stones or thunderbirds, but I would infinitely prefer that you spend your days quietly sequestered in Lakeside, out of sight, and I hope out of mind. When things get hairy, we'll need all hands to the wheel. Hope says here, the charm about the gods' names always makes me think of the dream Shadow has at the beginning about the hall of statues of all the dead gods. Hope, that is a lovely thought. That is a lovely observation. Great job. Yes. Yes, good. Yeah, and Becca says, oh, Hope, he knows them. They're not completely gone. You just made me so happy. Well, except the belief of another god does not seem to be sufficient for a god. It doesn't seem as though gods can simply hang around believing in each other. When we've met Chernobog and the Zarias, we got a perspective on that. We've had this sense that I mean, if that were true, then gods in community would be enormously powerful. Why wouldn't the gods all just take over a town like Lakeside and hang out? They would reinforce each other's belief. Certainly, Wednesday draws that distinction when he's talking about the sum of the people like me and people like you. The people who eat the honey, in this instance, can't create the honey. Gods can't, I would assert with a fair amount of belief here, gods can't believe. But there is a connection between this charm to know the names of all gods and that That secret room. Yeah. Don't ruin this, says Becca. I love it. I'm sorry. Yeah, that's fair. That's fair. That's not to say that it's not valid. I think that there's something else that's happening there. Yes. Okay, so we have Shadow confessing to Wednesday that he is responsible for bringing Laura back. We get these moments, I can't make her live again, he said. I don't even know why she's as dead as she ought to be. And then the coin, the inclusion of the coin, the intrusion of the coin into the narrative, this absent coin. This is just drawing Laura back. Okay, 1 minute left for one last slide. And here it is. This is almost the end of the chapter. And this is where we're going to wrap up chapter 10 for this week. Shadow wanted very much to reach out and put his hand over Wednesday's gray hair. And he wanted to tell him that everything would be okay. Something that Shadow did not feel, but that he knew had to be said. There were men in black trains out there. There was a fat kid in a stretched limo, and there were people in the television who did not mean them well. He did not touch Wednesday. He did not say anything. Later, he wondered if he could have changed things, if that gesture would have done any good, if it could have averted any of the harm that was to come. He told himself it wouldn't. He knew it wouldn't. But still, afterward, he wished that just for a moment on that slow flight home, he had touched Wednesday's hand. Gaiman rarely breaks linear chronology through the movement of this book. Pretty much, things happen in the event. Things happen in the order of events that is predictable and natural. But from time to time, he will throw forward. From time to time, he will break that linear sequence and give us a sudden perspective that is privileged, a sudden perspective that has seen more, that knows more. And of course, here in this plane, as we're returning to Chicago and thence returning to Lakeside, we get again this sense of the gathering storm. We get again the sense that there is darkness on the horizon and that it is getting closer. But crucially, later he wondered if he could have changed things, if the gesture would have done any good, if it could have averted any of the harm that was to come. He told himself it wouldn't. He knew it wouldn't. But still, afterward, he wished that just for a moment on that slow flight home, he had touched Wednesday's hand. He knows that whatever disaster is coming would not have been averted by that human gesture. But he still values the human gesture nonetheless. We will, of course, look at this much, much later when we have seen the terrible circumstances unfold. That, unfortunately, is the limit of my time this evening. Let's take a look at the next session. Next Tuesday, June the 20th, chapter 11. I will have the podcast for episode 7, A Prayer for Mad Sweeney, available tomorrow if you are listening to this live. That is Wednesday, June the 14th. I just realized that I haven't put a time on this slide. I think we're going to do it at the same time. I think it's going to be another evening session next week. I think it's going to be another 9 p.m. Eastern, 8 p.m. Central session. Stay tuned to Point North Media on Twitter, or head on over to pointnorthmedia.com and subscribe to the newsletter, or go to pointnorthmedia.com, click on the shows button, and you will see the calendar there. I will update that as frequently as I can. Yes, we're going to talk about episode 7, which is extremely good. The podcast for episode 8 will be a little delayed because next week, Daphne Olive is coming into town and we're going to record it live. We may even be able to do a little Storms on the Way live Q&A session with Daphne and Elizabeth and myself all gathered around the same table. If that happens, rest assured I will spread the word in every forum that I have available to me. We will definitely talk about it. Guys, thank you all so much for being here tonight, and I hope you'll be with me later in the week. Tomorrow I have, in addition to the Storms on the Way episode, on episode 7 of the TV show, I will also have the long-awaited There and Back Again listener email Q&A, kind of weird general. I'm going to talk about a few things. It's going to be a really fun episode of There and Back Again. And then on Thursday, we have our regular There and Back Again session. Then on Friday, the Point North Patreon exclusive live Q&A. It's another busy week here from Point North Media. I have a lot to talk about and a lot to look forward to, and I hope you will join me for all of it. Guys, thank you all so much for listening. It means the world to me. I will talk to you all again very soon. Take care.